I'm Sue Stockdale, and welcome to the Access to Inspiration podcast. I think inspiration is like a magical gift that's within all of us. It's like free energy that can be generated when we listen to someone talk about their experiences, insights, and what they've learned about life. During this series, our theme is creating impact, and our guests today are no strangers to doing this. Jennifer Wilde and Dan McClure's area of specialism is system innovation. Jen has over 15 years' experience in humanitarian response and bring together diverse groups to collaborate on addressing some of the biggest challenges that face a country after a disaster like a hurricane. In fact, she met her business partner, Dan McClure, when she was invited by the UN to speak at Berkeley, and about the innovation lab that she set up in the midst of an earthquake response in Nepal. And if Jen makes ideas happen, Dan makes those ideas come out in the first place. He has spent 40 years reimagining complex systems in business, government, international aid, and society as a whole. I was keen to learn from both of them about the tools that people can use to create impact across an entire system, and it's a fascinating conversation. Not least when Dan used gardening as a metaphor for system innovation. When you listen to this conversation today, it will invite new possibilities within you and make you think. Perhaps a question to consider as you're listening is, what might I notice if I stepped back to take a broader perspective? Welcome to the podcast, Jenny and Dan. It's great to be with you both today.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Sue.
Thank you. Great to be here.
And you're both in different parts of the world, I understand. Where are you based, Jenny?
Yeah, at the moment I'm down in New Zealand, avoiding COVID, soon to pop out back into the rest of the world.
Fantastic. And Dan, where are you?
I'm actually in Michigan, so in the United States, only a half a dozen time zones or so away.
So we're really having a global conversation tonight.
It is. It is.
Now, I'm curious to understand in our conversation today all about systems innovation, which I know you're both experts on. And maybe a good place to begin with is, how did the two of you come to be working together on this?
Well, I think from each of our perspectives, we've both been fascinated by big, hard, complex, gnarly problems. I started out in an industry that was being massively deregulated. And as a result, the first 10 years of my career were about the entire industry being changed every 2 years. And that sort of attraction to big, messy problems eventually led me over to the aid sector, where there are a lot of big, messy problems. And surprise, surprise, I found other people who were doing that. And that's where Jen and I met.
And in terms of your background, Jen, how did you come into this world of systems innovation?
I worked in global emergency management, so typhoons and earthquakes and civil conflicts for a long time. And you find a lot of big opportunities and messy problems there, whether it's educational systems or governance systems, getting water to people in desert populations who are moving because of violence, or many other challenges. And so that led me to looking at innovation methodologies that dealt with bigger challenges and bigger opportunities, which led me to Dan at a roundtable in Berkeley, where we said, hey, we're working on similar things, but in different places. We should do more of that.
Well, it sounds like that was a very serendipitous opportunity for you to connect together. Just to pick up on what you're saying there, Jenny, around humanitarian response. Certainly, every time I hear something on the news about a disaster in some part of the world, we always hear about a whole number of agencies turning up on the ground to be able to work on that disaster and the appropriate response. Is that the sort of situation that you would describe as a big, messy problem?
Yeah, that's almost the context you start with, or the marketplace for those in private sector. So a huge earthquake wipes out Port-au-Prince in Haiti, and then lots of emergency agencies from governments around the world, from non-profit and companies show up and say, what's even happening here? And what do we need to do to support people to first survive and then have opportunities long-term in their lives? It's essentially a twofold problem in that sense, because from the beginning, from day one, people have really kind of lost their future. I think it's the hardest time in a lot of people's lives. Maybe they imagined their kids going to university. Maybe they imagined having a different job. Maybe they were looking at building a house, or whatever you imagine your dreams are for the next 5 to 10 years. When an emergency hits, suddenly you're saying, I'm going to tear those up, I'm going to throw those away. And where am I? And what am I doing? And I've had friends go through this where they're stuck in a country with no media, no ability to find out what's happening. And they're hearing that the whole world's underwater. There's been some crisis globally, and this is the new. So it's terrifying at many different levels. Many people have lost families or family or friends. And so to come in as an emergency manager, it's not just about how do you provide food and water and shelter and emergency health care and education, but it's how do you deal with individuals and families and some of the best and worst of humanity to say, what future can you have now? How do we support you with some future, some hope that you want to look towards in the future? So I think that's where the complex problems come from. So that's where you start looking at, what does a housing solution that is durable look like? What does support against gender-based violence look like? What does supporting your children get some kind of care and education from the first months through to years afterwards look like? What kind of new governance systems need to be in place? So they're the big, gnarly problems, but also big opportunities that I've worked in supporting people with.
As I hear you describe that, Jenny, I can even almost feel overwhelmed by the complexity of the challenges that are faced in that type of situation. Dan, from your perspective, if we have to consider something like that from a systemic perspective, how does one tackle that type of situation and not be overwhelmed by it at the same time?
Well, I think the thing to remember is complexity is not chaos. So, inside these seemingly chaotic, complex challenges, there are real patterns. There are people doing things for reasons, there's cause and effect, there's actual systems that are in place. So if you simply look at the whole mess of things, it can seem like, well, there's no way I can understand this. And it doesn't even have to be something as truly daunting as, an earthquake or a hurricane. A lot of businesses face this sort of, oh my gosh, everything's happening in my industry. What am I going to do about it? Or government agencies as they try to tackle hard problems. So the thing that's good about complexity is that there is this structure underneath it. And so the real trick to not being overwhelmed is to step back and actually see that structure, see how all the pieces fit together, and then start to work with that.
So, in a business or in a disaster situation, I'm wondering whether managing emotions, managing uncertainty is also part of what you would help leaders and individuals to be thinking about how to manage.
Well, it's funny because I think emotion might seem to be the thing that always trips you up. I think what we find is it's often the person who's in their thinking brain that's the most dangerous because they have thought about the problem, like it with quote marks around it, and they have a solution. I was actually on a call this morning talking about responses to climate change. And we had some very passionate folks on the call who knew what needed to be done. And it was a very focused approach that had a lot of validity to it, but it began from them having already thought through the problem. And in many ways, the way to get beyond the emotion, the way to get beyond the narrow solution that you've already conceived is to step back and really try to understand what that problem is.
The temptation to jump in and do something immediately is almost to be unlearned, I guess is what I'm hearing from you, Dan. In your experience, Jen, from putting that into practice, what helps anyone to be able to do that stepping back effectively?
I think especially when you look at kind of entrepreneurs and innovators and people who want to do things from an evolutionary perspective, humans want to solve stuff. It's why we've survived. It's why we've evolved. It's why we've done so well in the world. The reality that we now live in is complex and difficult to understand. And we need to see that reality first, especially now this decade's been dubbed the roaring 2020s, where AI and biotech and energy tech and blockchain and a number of really world-changing technology is maturing. That is starting to shift all industries. You can do two things. You can say, we're going to make some incremental change. In a decade that significant change, significant globalization is tying us together and making the world more complex. And that's not enough. You can say, well, I see a small problem. I'm going to kind of look through this keyhole and I'm just going to work on this one piece of the problem, and maybe I'll come up with an app or a new water filter or whatever that might be, and solve for that. Or you can say, I'm going to open that door and I'm going to look at all of the different parts of this. What are the shifts that are happening in the world? What are the new entrants to the marketplace? What are the social trends and new capabilities, etc.? And to take that in really does take a stepping back and not just a jumping in. But I think that's where you can look at the harder problems and the bigger opportunities, and you can act very practically towards them rather than getting stuck on some of this incremental change.
Sue, one of the things that I think makes a lot of that work well is getting in the habit of drawing a picture. Just as I'm listening to Jen give the list of study the competitors and study the global trends, I'm going like, yee, that sounds terribly intimidating. But when you draw a picture of it, when you put those things down and show how they're connected, here I'm not talking a wallpaper size thing that covers the side of a room, but a diagram that you could set in front of your desk or on your computer screen that shows all the pieces and how they connect together. A lot of this stuff that feels like very daunting complexity becomes something that you can work with practically. And importantly, once you've got a picture, you can share it with somebody else. So other people can start to work with you collaboratively on that same complexity.
And I think I watched a little video, Dan, of you illustrating this picture concept in the idea of a garden.
Oh, I probably did at some point. I love gardens. And for me, the ideas of gardens are sort of like being able to do system innovation with God. They are complex pieces that all fit together, and you get to move the parts around and see how they interact. And what's interesting about a garden that's also true about a system innovation is that each change you make affects the rest of the garden. And that's part of what makes this both exciting and difficult is that you don't get to engineer the pieces in isolation. You get to draw that big picture and see how all the pieces fit together. But then when you move one piece, it affects the other pieces. Just in the same way, if you move a daylily, it's going to affect the darn peony that's up on the hill.
It's a lovely picture to have in one's mind of a garden and that dynamic, changing nature of where you place the plants and how they're affected by everything else. And I'm also curious what excites you about working in this space, because I always think people follow their passions. What makes both of you passionate about this?
For me, it's the fact that you can do things that you couldn't do before. So Doctors Without Borders have this fantastic program at the moment where they're bringing new scanning technology together, big data, 3D printing and robotics together with telemedicine. And they're providing people in the back of Yemen or Syria or wherever that might be, in Jordan and otherwise, with prosthetic, with really strong support from medical professionals. These people really have very little access to hospital or medical care. But because of what is now available, because they can bring the pieces of tech together with people who can access these areas with the kind of telemedicine of medical professionals all around the world, you can scan someone's limb, you can hear about the kind of range of movement they have day to day and where they live and what they need. You can get them professional support from anywhere around the world. And then you can provide them with a cheaper, faster, better prosthetic limb that is more customized to them, that is even in their skin color. And these things that might seem basic but end up being significant to the wearer within days, within weeks. And so that was not possible before. But by combining these pieces, and it's not just tech, it's processes, it's the way people think about telemedicine, it's attitudes and behaviors, you can do incredibly impactful things that are not possible when you just look at one part of a problem.
How about you, Dan? How did you get passionate about this subject?
It's funny because I was thinking, how am I going to follow up with Jen on this particular thing? I think for me, all the really interesting problems in the world are these complex system problems. There are some problems that you can invent something like a thing and boom, it's going to make a big difference. But that doesn't happen really all that often. And I'm not all that interested in just small incremental change. But reinventing how the world works, when you sit down in a business that has been around for 50 years, is established stalwart in its industry, and then you realize they're rethinking their entire role in the industry, their entire way of going to market, how they're going to create value for customers. They're going to deal with issues that have been outstanding for decades in their marketplace. There's a buzz that comes from that. You're being where the world is getting invented. And I think this idea of you get to play in the best problems and most exciting opportunities. I mean, that's what system innovators get to do. If you look at the things that Jen and I have been lucky enough to participate in the last year, we've worked on issues of climate change, of COVID pandemic response, of commercial business reinvention, of humanitarian aid response. They're the kinds of challenges when you imagine what you would really like to spend your life doing. This is exciting stuff. And it's the tool set that allows you to deal with that exciting stuff.
Well, it's a lovely segue into this practicality element that always intrigues me, Dan, when you talked about toolkit there. If we had a bunch of business leaders from an organization that showed up in our conversation today wanting to reinvent the way of working in their industry, how would you suggest that they go about starting doing that?
Well, so the key thing to understand about system innovation, it's really four key things. So first is that you've got to see bigger problems. So you've got to take the chance to step back and see a bigger challenge. The second is that you have to imagine more powerful, complete solutions. So you don't see the big problem and then propose to do a mobile app. Third, you have to realize that all the stakeholders of a system need to buy in. So everyone who's involved needs to get a pony. And that means you have to be a powerful storyteller, a person who can design trade offs. And this is true even if you're creating market products. Quick example, there was an organization that was building out large hospital systems, and they came up with great technology for doing that. But what they realized is they had to figure out ways for all the different support organizations to get a reward for adopting this system. And so it wasn't simply enough to have a big problem, a powerful solution. They also had to bring everybody along. And then finally, the fourth key skill is that you have to be able to evolve your transformational solution. So it's not you plan your project and deliver it, but rather you're continually evolving as you go along. And those are the four key skills that organizations need to build.
And maybe to add to that, Dan and I work with companies on digital transformations and agile transformations. We go into a lot of companies and they say, well, we need to spend 10% of our budget on large scale innovation, or we need to create a portfolio that looks like this. And all of those are good things to do. But I think it's shifting the question rather than everything needs to be digital to how does your organization easily and quickly go after big opportunities? How does your organization rapidly solve big challenges in the marketplace? And they're the kind of organizations that are winning today. Elon Musk is setting up systems for new transportation. Mark Zuckerberg is setting up an entirely new world, the metaverse, a new system. Tim Cook has made Apple a $1 trillion company through his ecosystem strategy. So those that are winning are shifting their companies through shifting systems. That sounds big and powerful, and it is. But essentially, it is going through the right kind of thinking and processes in the organization. So it's building an organization that works together with the right kind of strategy, alignment, leadership, and outcomes. This can sound big and scary, but none of it is rocket science. It's just about having the right tools.
I kind of imagine it like a pair of glasses, that it's how do you change your paradigm in the way that a leader looks at their business or their organization. And also, I get a sense, as both of you are speaking, about the difference between scarcity and abundance. I can think of so many boards that I've observed that sit around a board table and finance is facing with marketing and is not happy with sales. And it's everyone wants to keep their share of the pie and be recognized for their role in something. And yet, what I'm hearing from both of you is that it's almost turning that on its head. It's about looking for something bigger and how we collaborate together to change a system. That, for many people, isn't their normal way of thinking.
I love this idea of scarcity versus abundance because so much of traditional project management is based on the concept of scarcity, right? Scarcity of resources, scarcity of investment, scarcity of time. The thing that people miss about complexity is that complexity is bountiful. There is so much stuff you can do once you say the entire world is my toolkit. It becomes possible to imagine many more things simply because you can bring anything together. And this is one of the reasons why system innovators generally aren't in innovation labs, because innovation labs are about we're going to make a little small spot for innovation to happen. And system innovators are about seeing the entire world as something that is part of what they can weave together.
It's sounding very aspiring and inspirational as you're both describing it to me. And the theme of this series that we're recording is creating impact. So I think what you've been talking about so far is really giving me a sense that organizations can create even greater impact if they adopt a systemic perspective to how they're looking at their industry or their product or service or the impact they want to make.
Actually, I'd like to be even more aggressive with that. I don't think it's simply system innovation makes it possible for you to create greater impact. I think there's a good argument that in today's disrupted world, where change is bigger, faster than ever, the only way you can create impact is to really embrace complexity and do system change.
Dan and I recently did a study on innovation and change methodologies where we looked at 500 approaches to innovation change, tools, methods. What are people doing and how do they do it? And what kind of problems do the various methodologies solve? And what we found was there's a lot of work being done on project management, great at building huge buildings in Dubai, incredibly complex. There's been a lot of work, methodologies, tools done on the kind of incremental change. Ask the people in your company how we can improve. Ask people who use your products how we can improve them. There's been a fair amount of work done on thinking about small, fairly unexplored problems. What's a new kind of app? We're being pretty harsh on apps here, but what's a new kind of app? How are you going to make the next Angry Birds and make $1 billion? But the area of some of these big opportunities, really that's where system innovation fits, these complex problems. And we found very little outside system innovation in that space. So that was very interesting to us as we look through all the options of what can people practically do. And so that's where we've landed on systems innovation as the solution to the challenges we're going to face this decade.
You're blowing my brains, the two of you, in terms of, in terms of what you're making me think about. If you were going to recommend the first 2 or 3 steps for somebody who's intrigued by what you've been talking about today, and they wanted to effectively look at their garden from a systemic perspective, or their small project, the day-to-day challenge they may have in their business or their organization, maybe somebody who doesn't have a great deal of power or influence over the organization or the environment in which they're operating, Where would you really recommend them to start on this journey of looking at the world in a different way?
I think actually that is the beginning of the journey, is start looking at the world in a different way. Look broadly and just start looking at more pieces and see how all the pieces hook together. We've already talked about the idea of drawing pictures. That's a big part of it. But there's also sort of a personal version of that, of start crossing boundaries, start engaging in different fields that are not necessarily officially aligned with your job or your role. One of the positions we talk about is a choreographer, which is, if you think about a manager is about top down control, a choreographer is about cross cutting control. So they work across the silos, across the organizations, across the business domains. And I think this is one of the most profitable and easiest ways to get started in this field, is to just start looking more broadly and read different books, watch different things, explore different spaces. And it may seem like that's not going to get me anywhere right away. And in some ways, it isn't. On the other hand, it is going to provide you a foundation of broader thinking. And then you can start taking that into the different problems. Jen, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I love it. I would also say, if you've got a problem or if you've got a solution already, draw the way the world works now. Dan talked about drawing pictures. Who are the people involved? Where do the resources come from? What kind of activities do they do? How are they connected to stuff? How does that world work? And keep drawing it. And you can go on our website to have a look at some ways to do that, some examples of this. When I say draw a problem of what the world looks like, it's really drawing that system around that problem or solution. And then you can start to look for leverage points. So if I work on scanning technology within this kind of community in the back of Syria, what does that mean? If I work on 3D printing technology in London, what does that mean? So you can kind of play with how the world works, with find points of leverage, and then say, okay, so if I was going to change the world, if I was going to change my problem or create my solution, what would I have to change in this system? What would I have to change in the way the world works now, without my eyes closed, without pretending it's simple, taking in all that complexity? And I think that's a really simple way to do that. And we've done that with South Sudanese innovators in a couple of hours. This doesn't need to be a big, hard, difficult challenge. It's just, what's my problem and where can I really create impact?
Well, I think what you've both said, I've realised we're really trying to aim for within the Access to Inspiration podcast, since we've had 56 episodes featuring guests from, I think, 20 countries now. And hopefully our listeners are really getting a sense of that finding out about the world just through listening to a series of podcasts. It opens their mind. I'm always a great proponent of any of us putting our money where our mouth is and applying our principles that we espouse to others to ourselves. So I guess my final question to you both is, how do you keep innovating together? If both of you are a system, how do you innovate?
Well, first, I think it's impossible for Dan not to come up with new ideas and new ways of working. I mean, Dan is a global thought leader in innovation, so he didn't get there by staying static. And I think for me, it's about continuing to bite off harder problems and learn from them and change because of them. And again, it's very practical. It's not difficult to do, but it's taking some time to say, what am I learning here? What's the reflection? And what do I need to change knowing about the way that the world works right now?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's interesting, if you're talking about specifically the dynamics between Jen and myself, which I think is often reflected in many other creative partnerships, is Jen is an action hero. So you'll hear Jenny talk about, here's how you do things. I am a notebook filler upper. So I generate ideas in frequent profusion. We've talked about this choreographer role, and we really see these two types of choreographer, the visionary choreographer and then the action hero choreographer. And when you pair these folks up, they're really powerful together. And I think that's part of the energy that makes us work is Jenny makes action happen, I make ideas come out, and the two of them together work really well.
Well, I think you've given us a real living example of that value of having diverse teams, first of all, bringing differing strengths together and leaving our listeners with a way of looking at the world slightly differently from what they were before. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you both today. If our listener wants to find out more about the work that you're doing, how might they do that on the internet and social media?
Thanks. So it's been lovely spending time with you. They can go to our website, innovationecosystem.com. They can find us on Twitter at INNO_ecosystem. We're on LinkedIn as well. So go and have a look at some of the articles, have a think about being a choreographer, have a think about drawing pictures and where to start or where to continue your journey.
Or just go plant a garden. That's good too.
Get some daylilies. They're really pretty.
Thank you again, both. It's been brilliant to speak to you. And I wish you all the best with your next innovations, whatever they may be.
Thank you now.
Thank you, Sue.
Well, I loved what Jen and Dan had to say about system innovation and taking a step back to get a broader perspective. They also told me they're collaborating together on a book on this subject as well. And you can keep track of how that's developing at their website, innovationecosystem.com. Remember, you'll find transcriptions of all our podcast episodes on the website, accesstoinspiration.org. And you can sign up there for our newsletter by going to the bottom of the homepage. You'll find us also on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Just search for Access to Inspiration. Next time, I'll be talking to Carrie Court, founder of Sussex Green Living, and finding out about the milk float that they use to spread the word about the environment. Hope you can join us then.